A synagogue roll must be written on the skins of clean animals, prepared for the particular use of the synagogue by a Jew. Every skin must contain a certain number of columns, equal throughout the entire book. The whole copy must be first lined, and if 3 words be written in it without a line, it is worthless. The ink should be black, neither red, green, or any other color, and be prepared according to a definite recipe. An authentic copy must be the exact...
Writing and civilization began at the same time, about 5,000 years ago. And some of these first writings were so powerful that they still influence us today through the books of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. Now, this great book wasn't just written out by a few holy men in ancient Israel, by Moses and Isaiah and all the rest of them. It developed slowly, almost anonymously, and its character was formed in times of terrible national disaster. To the ancient Israelites, their Bible offered remedies, comfort, and sometimes even a glimpse of God himself.
There's a marvelous traditional Jewish story about a lot of rabbis who were having a noisy argument about a point of holy law. On one side of the argument was one rabbi, on the other a great heaving mass of them, all trying to shout him down. So the single rabbi who knew he was right decided to call on God, and he said, God, if I am right, may the trees that stand around us bend to the ground. And miraculously, all the trees bent to the ground. And still they shouted at him. So he called on God again, and he said, God, if I am right, may a heavenly wind blow through this assembly. And a great wind went through the assembly, but it didn't stop the rabbis. So in exasperation, the lonely rabbi called on God, and he said, God, if I am right, send me a sign directly. And a great voice boomed down from heaven, this man is right. And the noisy rabbis didn't stop. They told God to shut up because they had the real word of the Lord written down on tablets, Moses, Mount Sinai. They had a written text. It shows, I think, 2 things. The incredible tenacious scholarship of the rabbis and the veneration they accorded the written word. It stands, and has always stood, at the heart of Judaism, and it stands at the heart of every synagogue too. Protected by curtains and doors, the Holy Law. Still written on vellum scrolls, handmade, handwritten by scribes, exactly as texts were thousands upon thousands of years ago. The texts of the Hebrew Bible go back 2, 3, 4, perhaps even 5,000 years. But they reach their final form, the shape in which we have them today, between 2 distinctive events. One, the Babylonian exile of the Jews, and the other one was the destruction of Jerusalem itself by the Romans.
Jerusalem is the city of the Old Testament. It was King David's city. It was the heart of ancient Israel, and the faraway home that the exiled prophets saw in their mind's eye as they sat writing by the waters of Babylon. Even when the Jews had spread right throughout the ancient world, Jerusalem, with its great temple and its priests, stood at the center of the faith.
All around the eastern hills of Jerusalem, the dead are lying waiting for the last judgment. Jews, Christians, Muslims alike. We're all expecting, so tradition goes, for the Lord to appear in that blocked-up gate over there and deliver the judgment. I suppose over all of old Jerusalem, there's a terrible stillness, a terrible feeling of waiting. I think it's a feeling that was born in exile, particularly the exile of the Jews in Babylon 600 years before Christ. Now, it was the Persians who let them come back. They were there for about 2 generations. When they started to come back, they were very different people to the ones that had left Jerusalem 40, 50 years before. The leader of the first party actually had a pagan name, Zerubbabel, the seed of Babylon.
And he it was who started to rebuild the temple here. There was a rebirth of nationalism. The next generations of people had old Israelite names, Ezra, Nehemiah, people like that. So there was a difference. Now there was an understanding of history that had never been before. In fact, Judeans had left, but Jews had come back. The word was invented in Babylon. The Old Testament says that Ezra and Nehemiah, two prominent Jews of Babylon, went to Jerusalem at about a time that we would call 450 BC. Then it is said, Nehemiah had found the walls of the city so weak that foxes were jumping over them and knocking them down. And so he set the local population to rebuilding them.
They were also building at that time something yet more precious, the Bible itself. It's very, very difficult to find out what was going on. Nehemiah's not in these walls, he's in this book, and that's all there is. So we have to rely on what the book itself tells us about its own history. And that's rather interesting for this period, this vital period. Ezra, it said, gathered all the people of Jerusalem around him when he got here and read out the law to them. He read it out like a riot act, actually, because they were doing things they weren't supposed to do. Now, what was this holy law? It's obviously something written down, and it seems to have been something written down by Ezra himself, because the Bible tells us again, in another bit, that Ezra received the light of understanding from Jehovah and dictated the holy writings to the scribes. Now, that seems to put you in mind of somebody actually writing down a whole lot of verbal material, stuff remembered by priests over hundreds of years. But there must have been writing earlier. Obviously, Israel was quite a literate society, and there is one little memory in this Bible of a very ancient writing. In the 6th century BC, one of King Josiah's priests finds the Holy Scriptures lying around in the temple. So there you are. There is a sacred book of some description or other from the 6th century. That's as old as we can go, I'm afraid. There's no earlier mentions at all.
In the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, the Jews were becoming a truly international people. Excavations here at the island of Elephantine on the Egyptian Nile have uncovered the remains of one of these far-flung Jewish communities. What is especially fascinating is that Judaism here was in many ways quite different from that of Ezra's at Jerusalem. At places like this, you can start to dig up a part of the real world of ancient Judaism, as it existed outside the pages of the Bible. And this at precisely the same time as many of the Bible's books were being written.
This is the vast old enclosure wall of the temple of the god Khnum. And in the 5th century BC, in the Persian period, just behind it, in fact just over here, were little houses. And these houses seem to have been of the Jewish community, because in one of them was found a really remarkable lot of letters. And these letters are really important for the history of the Bible, because they show us a picture of a Judaism, a pious Judaism, which is very, very different from the Judaism of Ezra in Jerusalem. Now, this Jehovah here was worshipped in a small temple in a little building of sandstone and gold, and there were other gods in there as well, perhaps local Egyptian gods that came in as well. Now, the Jewish community turned up in this temple and they sung biblical psalms in it. But they intermarried freely with the local population, and they broke the Jewish law in many other ways, at least the Orthodox Jerusalem law. All these different sorts of Judaism had an influence on the Bible, but Ezra's would be the most important. The Jehovah which Ezra had in mind was one which had given out holy laws, and the priests around Ezra were the people who kept and held these holy laws. This is a God that you can actually interact with in a positive way. You can go along and you can say, I will do this and this and this, I will give this at the temple, I will listen to the priest, he will tell me this secret. And you get a God who is doing things in direct alliance with you. You are in alliance with God. You actually can affect your own destiny. This idea of man working, actively affecting his own destiny as an individual was hardly unique to Ezra or the returning Jews at Jerusalem.
The Greeks, for example, had been working in the Middle East, going all through the ancient towns, visiting the ancient temples, discovering, rediscovering sometimes the most ancient history of the gods, making, if you like, stories up about the gods and about men too. They too believed that men could influence their own destiny. But unlike the Jews, they believed that they could influence their destiny by politics and war. And that was an idea which would run through the world like fire. In the 4th century BC, the new Greek ideas were forced into the ancient East by Alexander the Great, who conquered everywhere from Greece to Persia. And wherever Alexander and his armies went, they founded cities, large Greek trading cities that lasted for 600 and 700 years and more. Their style, International Greek, is known today as Hellenism, and it affected everything from the city's buildings to the people's language, and indeed the very gods themselves. Alexander's Hellenistic cities held a lifestyle in them that Abraham and Moses couldn't have dreamt of. This new way of life would change